Some of the reasons you could be performing better in some subjects or courses than the others is probably because you're just interested in that course, or it could also mean that you generally just find it easy. But one of the reasons why that could be the case, I think one of the reasons which you haven't thought about could be that you're using one study technique throughout all your subjects and your courses, and that study technique is basically based for that same subject or course that you are passing. Now, having established that as one of the reasons why you could be performing better in one subject than the others, in this video we're going to talk about how you decide what kind of technique to use for what subject. So basically we are going to talk about studying different subjects differently. So if you think that is something that is going to be helpful to you, then stick around. Hello everyone, my name is Simon, a second year medical student at the University of Zambia. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now if you're new here, remember to subscribe to my channel, leave me a like, and also share this video with other friends. Now I also hope the audio of this video is okay. Unfortunately my lavalier mic stopped working. I don't know what I did to it, so I just have to shoot with the microphone of the phone. So I hope the audio quality isn't that bad. So having established that, let's get back directly to our topic for today. Now we are going to approach this concept of studying different subjects differently in three basic steps. Now I realize that different people have got different ways of studying, so a study technique is not going to work exactly the same for different people. However, all different kinds of studying are supposed to be based on some basic principles, those which confer with effective kind of learning. So there are some techniques which you think are good for you but might not be effective. So it is also good that you are a bit dynamic and try out new things, but regardless of the uniqueness of people, there are some basic concepts which have to be made for an effective study techniques, and I talk about that mostly about most of the techniques that I use and the research around it. But now I'm going to be talking about the basic principles in relation to a specific subject and how you choose which study technique you are to use for that specific subject. Okay, so the first thing, or rather the first stage, is to define the kind of information that subject or course is predominantly occupied with. Now what I mean by the kind of information is we are going to categorize this kind of information into two. We are going to say there is factual kind of information and then there is conceptual. So by factual I mean that information which is basically facts, as in you have to just know it. Let's say for example my name is Simon. That is a fact. You just have to know it, you just have to remember it. But there are some information which are concepts, whereby you have to understand the underlying principles, and that concept can be applied in so many ways. So you don't necessarily memorize that. You have to understand it, although there is also some facts to that concept which you have to remember, but it is predominantly a concept which you have to just get the basic concept, and then which you can apply in so many other ways. So you have to know what kind of information that subject has. Now I realize that a subject is not going to be purely conceptual or purely factual. Different subjects are going to have different proportions of this kind of information, so it is up to you to determine what predominates that. So an example, I think a general example which all of us can understand, is history. History is basically factual, but it is not purely factual. There are some other things in history, I believe, although I'm not a history student, but I did it at secondary school, junior secondary actually. But I know there are some concepts which you have to understand there, but I could say maybe 75 to 80% of it is actually facts which you have to memorize. But if you talk about sciences, like sciences, there are a lot of things also which you have to know, you have to memorize, but most of it is conceptual. There are some concepts, so you have to know what techniques to use. So the same technique you use to study science is not necessarily going to be the same for the way you are studying history. Now if I bring it back to the more like, because I'm a medical student, I'm going to relate more if I use those examples, but they are going to be basic examples such that anybody in any field can relate. So I'm going to take two examples like anatomy and physiology. So for those who do not know what these two things are, anatomy is basically the studying of structures, like, okay, this is the hand, this is the nose, these are the eyes and stuff. Of course it is more detailed like that, but I'm just simplifying it so that a lot of people can relate. And physiology talks about the function. Now, what is the function of the hand? Okay, for movement, how does it do that? So there is a lot of concept to that. However, these two things work hand in hand. But you have to know that for you to know that this is the hand, there is not a lot of concepts to know. You just have to know it, just memorize it. Yeah, but for you to understand the functions and how everything happens, you have to understand it. So that is conceptual and factual. So let me emphasize this point again. There is not a very clear indication and line to say, okay, this information is purely factual, this information is purely conceptual. Not really. Like in some concepts, there are going to be some facts which you have to remember. And even some facts are better remembered if you know a specific concept behind it. But what I want you to know is to just decide what predominates that course. If it is filled with a lot of facts, then there is a specific study techniques you have to employ for that. If it is filled with a lot of concepts, there are some specific techniques that you have to employ for that, so that you can get the best out of both kinds of subjects or courses. Okay, so after we have decided or defined the kind of information that subject or course is filled with, the next thing we have to do is to now select the actual study techniques. Now I'm going to give some examples, although I'm not going to recommend like clearly as if it is gospel truth. No, for this, use this technique. I'm going to use some examples and state the underlying principle behind it, so that you can also use your own techniques, but so that we can be on the same basic principles. So for those subjects or courses that have got a lot of factual information, you want to use study techniques that have got a lot of active recall and spaced repetition. Of course, there is active recall and spaced repetition also in the conceptual, but the kinds of questions you're using for active recall are going to be different. So like for example, for flashcards, basically mainly I use it on a multiple of my courses, but mainly for anatomy, because flashcards are ideal for those factual kinds of information. Even like diagrams, I can just snip a diagram from a book and hide all the structures, and it will be coming as flashcards. So there is a lot of more like memorizing the structures, so I actively recall them, not like going through the diagram where the structures are there already to go and check them out. And then there is also the issue of spaced repetition. Now if you don't know what spaced repetition and active recall is, I highly advise that you go back to my previous video. I think the first video I talked about this was my 3 most effective study techniques. Yeah, and there are also some videos which follow that, where I talk about active recall and spaced repetition, for those who do not know what that is. Yeah, so I can be using even past paper questions and everything. And then for conceptual kind of questions, I still use active recall and spaced repetition, but I do not use mainly flashcards, because flashcards have got like isolated kinds of information, but I would rather use integrative kind of problems. So these are questions basically maybe from past paper questions, even self-made questions. Like the way I make them, it's different from the way anatomy flashcards are. So like for anatomy flashcards, I could say probably, what kind of cells make up the muscle tissue? That is just an example. What kind of cells make up the muscle tissue? That I have, yes, there are a lot of concepts which I have to remember from that, but it is a bit factual. You understand, right? It is a bit factual. But in physiology, I will not necessarily talk about the kinds of cells. I will talk about how those cells work. So if I want, I can even relate that factual information with the conceptual. I'll say, okay, depending on the structure of these cells that make up the muscle tissue, how does this structure relate to their functions? So I'll look at what they accomplish, and then I have to look at a lot of concepts. It is very integrative. I hope you can relate to that, or you can understand that, but that is the basic thing. Then when I say integrative kinds of questions, for those people who be using even textbooks, some textbooks like at my first year, they will even show you these are integrative questions. Look at a lot of questions which are applicative, like they have a lot of scenarios and applications. Those are the kinds of questions that are going to help you cement on your concepts, because they are not going to be predominantly about memorizing certain facts. It's about learning a concept and then applying it in different kinds of information. Okay, so apart from just the kind of study technique that you're using, it is also going to depend on the frequency and the time distribution that you are using for these kinds of topics. So for for subjects which are factual, you have to spend less time encoding that information and more time reviewing it. You understand, right? Like for example, if you have a diagram, like a diagram, maybe structures of the body, where you have to know those structures, it basically does not make a lot of sense for you to spend a lot of time just looking at those things, just being there, just looking at them. It is best to look at them. You try to understand everything, and you know them, and then you can review them after some time again. You try to use active recall to remember them. But for conceptual kinds of information, it is best to spend a lot of time encoding that information so that you actually digest it to its simplicity. Feynman technique, remember the Feynman technique. If you don't know what that is, again, go to that video that I mentioned earlier. So you spend a lot of time trying to understand that the first time, and then you spend less time revising it, because I'm sure all of us know that if you understand a concept really, really well, it does not, you don't forget it that easily. So you won't have to revise it as frequent as facts. So there is time distribution. Spend a lot of time understanding the concept if it is conceptual, and then you have to spend a little bit less time reviewing it. But for factual kinds of things, spend less time learning them for the first time, and then just review them more frequently. So that is in terms of time distribution and frequency of reviewing everything. Okay, so the third and last, basically one of the most basic of the three steps that I talked about, is actually execution. So you can plan all you want, but if you don't act on those plans, like, the information will basically be useless. So you have to make a conscious decision to do these things. We understand that you can make a plan about how you're going to go through the entire subject and stuff, and then when you go to study, you start doing something which just feels intuitively right. You just start studying passively, just reading through the book and stuff. So make a conscious effort, a deliberate one actually, to move from your comfort zone, or to leave your old studying ways which you think were not effective, and try something new and self-reflect to see if there is any improvement or not. If there is improvement, then work at getting better. If there is no improvement, look at where you went wrong, or maybe you got the study techniques wrong, or maybe those study techniques, how you're applying them, basically they don't work for you, and try something else. So that is the third step, which I think is very basic, but I think it was very important that I mentioned it. Alright guys, that's it for today. I hope you liked this video and found this information helpful. If you did, again, leave me a like, and if you haven't subscribed already, subscribe to my channel, and also share this video with a couple of friends. If you have any questions, or you have counter thoughts or an advice for me, remember to leave them down in the comments. For that comment section is for you guys. I read and reply to all comments. I think that's it for today. See you next time.